Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a consultant chartered psychologist in the UK. I'm absolutely fascinated by human behaviour, but particularly criminal human behaviour. What makes a person do what they do? What makes a killer a killer? What makes a murderer a murderer? Before I start, if I could ask you to please like, subscribe, share, and feel free to put some comments below, that'd be really great. In today's episode, which is a podcast episode, I'm going to look at the case of the Brixton cult. This was a cult, or a collective as they like to call it, that was formed and headed by one Comrade Bala. It involves 2 suspicious deaths, slavery, entrapment, and the birth and a bizarre situation where this child was able to go under the complete radar of all the authorities for 30 years, or the best part of 30 years, until at some point she was able to escape the clutches. And it's interesting. It's a really interesting case because it went to court, and it's interesting the actual protagonist in all of this, who to this day would still say he did nothing wrong. On Christmas Eve in 1996, Sian Davis was allegedly taking a bath. She opened the window and fell out. Breaking her neck, she was taken to a nearby hospital and would remain in a coma for some months. Eventually, she succumbed to her injuries and died. Sian Davis had been a member of the Brixton cult known as the Workers' Institute of Marxist-Leninism-Mao-Zedong thought. Not exactly a snappy title. It was often just known as the Workers' Institute. She had come across the leader of this cult, or collective as they would like to have been called, Aravinda Balashkrishnan, known as Comrade Bala, when she was a student at the LSE, the London School of Economics, in the early 70s. She was taken with his Marxist and communist ideas. She wasn't the only one. At one point, the collective could boast nearly 100 members. But one by one, most of them, including all the men that had been members, would tail off, leaving about 7 women. By the late 70s, after closing their Mao-supporting bookshop in Brixton, the Workers' Institute would move to various properties in the South London area. It was in these properties that Comrade Bala would have a reign of terror over the women there. Sian Davis would become pregnant by him, and both would deny parenting the subsequent child, Katie, who, along with the other women, would be held captive by Comrade Bala for 30 years. It would take Katie nearly 30 years to escape the clutches of Bala and her mother, and both of them, remember, denying any parental involvement. Apparently, when she asked who her parents were, they would say that she was a foundling, and when she heard the rumours from the other collective members that she was indeed Sian's baby, they would just say that it was Sian that had found her. Bala would say to her he wanted her to be his foot soldier. Other members of the collective would also be recruited from the ranks of students at the London School of Economics in the early 70s. And the UK in the late 60s and the early 70s was an absolute hotbed for communist and Marxist beliefs. So various different organisations would pop up supporting various different communist leaders. Bala's particular interest was Mao. He had been born originally in India and at the age of 8 had gone to Singapore. And it was the overthrow of the Singaporean government in the 60s that he was particularly interested in achieving. So much so that he came on the radar of the Foreign Office and the Secret Services of both countries, and he was stripped of his citizenship. Some of the other women, alongside Sian Davis, that were involved in the commune were Aisha Wahab, who was originally from Malaysia, and she'd attended the LSE on a scholarship. Josephine Herivol, she was from Belfast, and she was a gifted musician. And it was Josephine who, after many years of subjugation, of beatings, of humiliation from Bala, would eventually call a charity that had set up to help people in similar situations called the Palm Cove Society. She seemingly had seen their telephone number on the television and miraculously had memorised it. And on a rare outing, when she was able to, she phoned them. What happened next was quite incredible. She had arranged to meet them with Katie. The society had also contacted the local police. And, amazingly, Katie and Josephine were met. It would come out later that the reason that Josephine had contacted them was that she was worried about Katie. Apparently she was a diabetic, she'd lost huge amounts of weight, and nobody within the house was taking any note of her medical needs. Although Katie's birth was registered, there was never any follow-up about school attendance, health visitor appointments, doctor appointments, nothing at all. She just very quickly slipped off the radar. And when Katie and Josie were released, the police would also soon release Aishar Wahab, who quickly joined them at the Cove Society's headquarters in Leeds. Apparently the three women were so close that they would even put the bit in the middle and finish each other's sentences. They were able to tell their rescuers and the police what life was like within this cult. Bala ruled with an iron fist. He was an out-and-out Marxist who believed that China was soon to take over the world. He was paranoid. He believed that everything was being controlled by supreme governments. He would claim every single man-made or natural disaster was all part of the conspiracy theory of big government, and he alone could protect the cult and the rest of the world should they choose to join him. Katie would say, although she had a lack of education, she can't remember who, but somebody in the cult taught her to read and write, and she would read voraciously. That was the only thing she was allowed to do. In her late teens, she was allowed to watch the television. Up until that point, she would read. And she said that he would have huge amounts of philosophical, psychological, and ideological books sent, but would never read any of them. However, she would. She said she had nothing else to do. One of the other women in the cult was Bala's wife, and when he was arrested and charged, she also was. However, later, no charges were brought against her. In 2015, he would appear at Southwark Crown Court on charges of rape, sexual assault, child cruelty, assault, and false imprisonment between the years of 1976 and 2013. Even though he claimed he didn't recognise the authority of the court, he was still found guilty and he was sentenced to 23 years. Incredibly, some of the cult members would still campaign for him outside of the court, and amazingly, Josie Herrival, in time, would also return to South London and campaign for his release. So, who was the Workers' Institute? I'm not going to say the whole name again because that was really quite beyond me, but who were the members of the Workers' Institute, a cult, and how did they end up there? And importantly, how did they stay for such a long time? So if we look at cults and think about cults, we tend to think of the big cult names like Charles Manson or Jimmy Jones, David Koresh. But we tend to look at the big ones, the ones that grab all the attention. However, there are little cults popping up all over the world all the time. They have a few members, they have a few people that are so idealistic of what they're being told that they will stay. And that is essentially what a cult is about. It is about a collective of people who seemingly all share the same ideology. Now, we could call any religion because we all share a same ideology. But what we don't do generally is to coerce people and threaten people into not leaving the cult. Leaders of cults seem to have certain characteristics. Now, I'm really loath to use the term charismatic because that suggests something good and positive, but it's something that is attractive to people that are led towards finding their purpose. Now, I kind of want to divide this into two. So if we think about the leaders, so yes, we could say the word charismatic or magnetic, I think is probably a little bit of a better term. They all are, of course, narcissists, that goes without saying. They all have a belief that they are a godlike, they are a powerful figure. They believe that they know everything. Bala would have all of these books sent, and apparently he would have them all stacked around so everybody could see that he'd had these books sent, but he never read them. They would demand absolute obedience, and they would be completely and totally manipulative, and they would install paranoia into the members of the cult. And this is quite often why people get fed up and leave, because they just don't buy into all that. Apparently it got so bad within the Brixton cult, the Workers' Institute, that when it came to cooking the meals, two of the women had to cook the meals at the same time to ensure that one of them wasn't poisoning. They would be set upon each other. And one of the things that Katie said about her mother was the worst bully. She described her as being Bala's number one lieutenant. Anything that went against his rules, she would be the first to tell him. She would try and get people into trouble, and she did it most to Katie. She was trying to prove to Bala that she wasn't in any way, shape or form attached to Katie, maternally or otherwise, and that he was her first loyalty. She was completely brainwashed by him, and it's a little bit like the podcast that I did last time about Leanne Smith and Martin Smith. It's that dependence that one person grows upon another. That other person completely enjoys having somebody dependent on them and just absolutely magnifies it. But it's a type of personality, and we'll come on to that a little bit later about the kind of person that ends up in a cult. That's what was going on. So you have somebody that idealistically would draw people to them in the first sense. He exploited a group of women that were all far away from home. This is the common denominator. They were all far away from their homes. Malaysia, there was one lady from Tanzania, Belfast, Josephine Herrival, Wales in Sian Davis's case. Now, maybe not too far away from home, or they had family problems, and it's not one or the other, or they were lonely. And that's probably the absolute key to why these women were attracted to this group of other people that seemingly weren't so different from themselves, but they were being held, and I use that term correctly, they were being held by one person. And eventually the brainwashing gets so strong that they don't believe that they can cope without that one person, Bala, telling them what to do. And throw in abuse, threats, rape. Apparently he would send certain members of the group out to work and also claim benefits. So the money would come into him and he'd be in control of that. To begin with, apparently Sian Davis was reasonably wealthy and he just used all of her money all the time. But when that ran out, various members of the group would have to go out to work. He would control all of the finances. He would control what they went out for. Was it for work? Was it for shopping? And he would decide who was eating what and when. Apparently, Katie would say at 6 o'clock every evening, they had to all go in to a living room and watch the 6 o'clock news, which, if there was anything on there that displeased him, he would rant about. When the absolute murderous and dreadful events of Tiananmen Square were being broadcast, he was sitting there saying, well, it's only 3,000 people that have died. It should have been 3 million, because they were rising up against his beloved Maoist communism, and he believed that more people should have died. This is a completely deranged man. Bala, in his godlike state, would claim that the Challenger disaster was all part of a conspiracy, and only he was able to save the rest of the world from the annihilation that was apparently going to take place. And how he got to that point, I'm not too sure. There's not a huge amount of background about him, that he was Indian by birth. His father had to go to Singapore to work, and he and the rest, and Bala and the rest of his family, when Bala was 8, would join him in Singapore. And if we go back historically, Singapore, being a British colony, was fighting for its independence. Maybe that appealed to him. And then when he started to see what was going on in the rest of Southeast Asia about independence and inter-country wars, That was obviously clearly what interested him. But from a personality point of view, from the beginning, he was obviously very narcissistic. He was obviously quite intelligent as well, which is a really bad mix. And he just got himself into a position of his own little world authority. Apparently, I've read somewhere that he was one of the founders of the British Communist Party. I'm not too sure if that's true or not, but what is true was that he was kicked out of the Communist Party of Britain in the early 70s because he was splitting. He was trying to have a different form of communism, one that was just so completely way off the scale. Over the years, there were various charges brought against him. In the early to mid-70s, he ended up in Brixton jail I can't remember, some kind of sedition charges, but he was in there for a very limited amount of time. But two of his followers would go and visit him. This is when there were still some men around. There were two followers that would go and visit him and decide to assault some prison officers. And when they themselves were up in court for the assault on the prison officers, they were singing "Long Live Chairman Mao." Afterwards, because they weren't British nationals, they were both deported. But this is the type of person that is attracted to a group. They're kind of disparate people that all find each other, feel that they've got a commonality. And if that commonality is then led by somebody that is magnetic or charismatic, that's exactly what happens. So if we think about a cult structure as well, ideally, they believe that they have the same goals. In Bala's case, it was to take over the world with communism. In a lot of cases, it's all about just their power and their control. So, yes, there's a same goal, or there's a same belief of a same goal. There are punishments and repercussions if you break any of the rules of the cult, and these could be changed on an hourly, if daily basis. You're set against each other. So there's a high tension, there's a high anxiety within the cult because, as Katie would say about her mother, you're trying to show that you're the one that is true to the beliefs of the cult and, of course, beliefs of the member. You're trying to curry your favour, if you like. There's also a sense of paranoia within a cult. And again, that is encouraged by the leadership because that keeps people in their place. If they're so worried and anxious all the time, they then may not look at the bigger world. They might not actually see that there's a bigger world out there that has got far better things to offer than this crummy little paranoid and anxious existence that people in the cult are at the time living. Some of the former members, and these were male members that would come out at Bala's trial, they were told that they weren't up to scratch and they were also sleep deprived. And if they didn't turn up to a lecture or an appointment with the rest of the cult or the leader of the cult, they were then told that they were useless, they were bourgeoisie, that they were imperial, that they were part of the imperial state that they themselves were meant to be fighting. And if at all there was any debate within the cult, they were put down immediately and told that they were the enemy. So there was no discourse, there was no discussion about other people's points of view or other worldwide points of view. It had to be Bala's way or no way. And it's interesting that it was only women that would stay within the cult. And as I say, I think there's something about a group of people that have very dependent personalities getting together and suddenly becoming very dependent on each other, on the chairman and on their situation, because they would believe that they didn't have any alternatives, and he would have propagated that they had no alternatives. Throw in the child Katie from an early age, from a baby obviously, and seemingly, although she was treated appallingly and she was beaten by him, there was a certain instinct, just survival instinct, just niceness between most of the women there, that they wanted to look after her. Hence Josephine Herrival contacting the agency to help her because they were worried about her. It's interesting, at Bala's trial, when he was asked by one of the prosecuting counsel how he felt, if he felt any responsibility towards anybody in the sect, including his own daughter, apparently he waved his hand dismissively and said about Katie that she was a liar and a fantasist who was creating her own trauma. He took no responsibility. Again, this is very much a theme about a lot of the killers that I discuss on Why Killers Kill. Now, the one thing I should point out was nobody at all was questioned or prosecuted over the deaths of Sian Davis or Oh Keong. It was interesting, at Sian Davis's coroner's inquest, I don't think there was a coroner's inquest for Oh Keong, but there was for Sian Davis. And the coroner was desperate to get some information from some of the other sect members, but she was stalled at all times. They just said that Sian Davis was having a bath, she'd opened the window and she'd fallen out. The coroner strongly criticised the group. She said that she couldn't understand how Sian had come to fall out of the window. The coroner said, "I wanted to call everybody in the house as we had a mystery. There was no other way of describing it. I still find it hard to know how she fell out of the window. Indeed, what was she doing opening the window at that cold time of year?" It seems, again, the authorities could have intervened, especially now we know that Katie was there, but apparently if any authority figure ever came round to the house, the council, say, for instance, because it was a council accommodation that they would live in, and if any authority or agency figures would come round to the house, Katie was taken out by one of the other women, so she wasn't there. So seemingly, the local authority, Lambeth or Southwark, because they cross borders, had no idea that Katie even existed. And we'd like to think that if they did, they would have intervened, but who knows? So I think there was a frustration there from the beginning, and I think put that together and the stuff that had happened a few years before with Bala, where he'd been jailed as well, and they just completely went underground and largely went unnoticed by the authorities, by the neighbours. Sometimes this is called collective blindness, where people know that there's something going on, but for whatever reason choose to ignore it. Apparently there would be times where people would ask about seeing Katie at the window, and they were met with aggression by Bala. So, of course, they backed off. But nobody quite took it that next stage further and informed the social services. Incredibly, in the late 70s, a doctoral student approached the group, found the group and approached the group and asked if he could do some research on them. And, of course, this appealed completely to Bala. Not only was he able to get his message out, but also this was his moment to shine and for people to listen to him. But the report, the subsequent PhD, would say that the Workers' Institute, brackets Bala, would claim an absolute monopoly, I'm quoting it, would claim an absolute monopoly on the truth as only correct upholders of the line of the Communist Party of China. Bala filled members' time to prevent anybody gaining experience or knowledge that might allow them to challenge his leadership. It speaks volumes, and yet this was 1979. I know Katie wasn't born to a few years later, but there was obviously something very sinister going on at that time. In the late 70s, they were known around Brixton. They had a bookshop there, and they had a big sign for Chairman Mao in their bookshop. Brixton was a place in the 70s where there were quite a lot of left-wing bookshops, so it probably wasn't that unusual. But they were known for handing out ridiculous leaflets to people, to hanging banners promoting Marxism and especially Maoism. And it's interesting that I talked about one of the reasons why people would find this collective when they were disparate souls and lonely souls themselves, that Josephine Herrivel's family, they were from Belfast apparently. Her father was a lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast, and he was also part of the team that broke the Enigma code at Bletchley Park. And when he died, there were quite a few obituaries to him, obviously, because he was a man of historical note. And it was only noted that he had, instead of 3 daughters, because the family had disowned her by this point, it was only noted that he had 2 daughters. And if we talk about families, it seems that in some cases there were still families wanting to contact their daughters. And when Sian Davis was actually in hospital, apparently her family were asking where she was. Had she been able to contact them on a regular basis, I'm not too sure, but they suddenly popped up and they were asking where she was. Bala would tell them that she was out of the country, she'd gone to India, and just for his own little perverse thrill, would also add that she also sent her love to them. She was lying in a coma in a hospital, having fallen out of a window under what seems to be highly suspicious circumstances. And I think that's what surrounds both of these deaths. But as I did say, nobody has been charged or prosecuted for them, so we must add that. But the gullibility and the susceptibility of the people that were drawn towards the cult is quite an incredible psychological phenomenon. And the fact that there are still people now that believe that he shouldn't be in jail, that he was wrongly jailed, and unfortunately probably believe what he said about his own daughter Katie in court, that she was a liar and a fantasist. Katie, who waived her right to her anonymity so she could appear in a couple of programmes and also get her story out, which is a very interesting story, of course. And she would say about Bala that she didn't like the fact that he was in prison because it was kind of a balance to her imprisonment by him. And I think she didn't want that association. She would say, quote, "I didn't want him to spend that long in prison. He put me in prison and now I put him in prison, and it just feels wrong. It feels like petty revenge, which I don't believe in." So even for her limited skills and experience of the world, here is somebody that has a core and a goodness about them that she doesn't want the person that perpetrated her and other people's miseries to be in prison for such a long time. He was given, quite rightly, a substantial sentence for what he did to so many people for such a long time. You're listening to Why Killers Kill, Analysis of Murder with me, Dr. Jane. There's a back catalogue of Why Killers Kill podcasts available on all the usual platforms, and if you could give a nice 5-star review, then more people can find out exactly why killers kill. These days, Katie, with the help of the charity and various agencies, she lives in the north, I believe, and she's making an okay life for herself. Up until a few years ago, she was still very much in contact with her. She didn't go back to the cult. They would get together. Apparently, they would watch soaps together. So she was still very close to some of the people that she'd grown up with. You've got to remember, she had grown up with a lot of women in her life. Some of them, her own maternal mother, weren't very nice to her, but some of them would look after her. These would potentially substitute maternal figures for her, looking out for her. So she still has a closeness with at least one of them. Unfortunately, Josephine Herrival went back because she couldn't deal with life without being told what to do, what to think, and bizarrely and amazingly subsequently campaigns to get that life back. And remember, she was cut off from her family. I don't imagine there's many cult members whose families haven't tried to withdraw them or get them out of cults, and it is so incredibly difficult. It has to be done with such delicacy and such professionalism and experience. And I know that in a lot of cases, let's just look at some of the cases in the States where the people are taken out of the cult, or it has to be their decision, or it has to seem to be their decision. And as much as you like to sweep somebody up and take them away, like Josephine was, they'll eventually go back because that's all they've known for such a long time. It's got to be introduced on a more emotional and intellectual level rather than just a practical and can't you see what's wrong with this situation type of level. So it's a really interesting factor, cults, and obviously it's the people that start them is one thing. You can't be a cult on your own. It's the people that start them is one thing, but it's the people that are attracted to them, and there are very common denominators about the people that are attracted. Low self-esteem, of course, comes into this, the belief that you can't make it on your own. And of course, if you've got a character like Bala constantly telling you that you won't be able to, it's not impossible to think that's why people would stay. And people ultimately fear not being part of the group. And when Bala, remember, would say to people that if they disagreed with him or didn't do what he wanted, they were part of the bourgeoisie imperialistic state, people didn't, members didn't want to be that one that was being castigated. It's a little bit like when you're in school and you're in the class and there's one person being told off and seemingly singled out to be told off. And you don't want to be that person. You sit there with that sense of relief. And I think that's one of the reasons why these women stayed there. Most of them didn't know anything else. They were quite young when they signed up. They were gullible, they were susceptible, And a lot of them didn't know anything else. They would go out to work, to shop, so they did know what the outside world had to offer. Usually in cults, and when they get back, they end up being deprogrammed. So they probably would have had to told Bala exactly what they'd done, who they'd seen, what they'd bought, those type of things, just so he had his absolute and utter control. So Bala is still serving his 23-year sentence. There are still some women campaigning for his release. And this maybe isn't so bizarre if you think about it, because it's all they've known. It's what they have invested 100% of their lives in. And for that to be taken away by the courts, by the prison service, by the police, to them leaves them completely at sixes and sevens as to what they're going to do. So if they can rally themselves in some kind of group towards the collective goal of getting him released, it's history repeating itself, but hopefully this time within that group there is no aggression or beating. And I should think and hope these days they are very much on the radar of the police and the authorities in South London.
Thank you ever so much for watching, listening, and I hope you found this case interesting. It's a really fascinating case. You don't get that many cults in the UK. Well, they're a bit of a rarity across the world, of course, but especially in the UK, so it's a really, really fascinating case. If I could ask you to please like, subscribe, share, and please do put some comments below. It'd be really interesting to see what people think about this. Thanks ever so much, and until next time, keep safe, and goodbye.